Politics these days are divided into two factions, the left and the right. Most political commentators talk about it in those terms. Even normies uses those terms. But what if I told you that they are all wrong, and this perpetual wrongness is likely what's causing the political rift and democratic backsliding in the world? Because this complexity makes it hard to identify the bad guys. You can't tell which political ideology is bad if you don't even know where you stand. That's why we get weeks of people tiptoeing around calling Elon Musk a Nazi, which he is. But if all these people are wrong, who's right? Me, I'm right. Aiden, smartest boy, fattest boy, the idiot genius. Let's get started. Anyone who pays attention to politics will likely think that the political spectrum looks something like this. A straight line between left and right and all the political ideologies falling in between. If you're extremely well read, you might even think it's one of the more complicated multi-axis models. But the truth is that politics actually looks like this. Okay, that's too complicated. Let's simplify it to this. Okay, that's still too complicated. Let me use my game design chops and simplify it further to something like this. Perfect. We're looking at just these 5 scales today, starting with representation. Representation measures our individual abilities to affect policies. Do we all have an equal ability to move the political scale, or do some people matter more? Do some people count for more weight? You don't even have to be able to actually move the scale. If everybody has 0 power, that is still equal representation. And even just here on this first scale, we already run into a problem with the traditional left-right spectrum. Optimal anarchy and libertarianism both have equal representations, but are on complete opposite ends of the left-right spectrum, and this is due to the balance of all the other scales that will affect what the final political position of a person will be. For example, the second one, institution. Do you like larger governments or smaller governments? Here, the classic left-right spectrum fails again, because while being on separate end of the scale of representation, the Chinese Communist Party and the Vatican Church are the same. They both have overreaching institutions that spreads across the entire world, but what separates them is their scales of representation. The CCP's power is concentrated in a small number of hands, while the church leaves its rules to its different parishes. And you might be thinking, "Fat man, why didn't you use conservatives and progressives as an obvious example of institutional sizes? Isn't that what it's usually defined as?" The problem is, most people don't realize that modern conservatives and progressives both want similarly sized institutions, and they both want similar reach for their government. In the US, for example, the last few extraneously open government agencies were by conservatives. The difference isn't the size, but the direction. When in time does your policy take effect? How much do you want policies to change the future, and how much do you want to preserve the past? Conservatives want their policies to keep them in a current situation. That's the conserve part of conservatives. Progressive wants to change, to make different choices that's never been made before, whether better or worse. That's still progressive. Most people flip-flop on the progressive or conservative scales depending on the policies they want. For example, when progressives were fighting to preserve Roe v. Wade, they were actually, for that moment in time, conservatives. But if they were conservatives then, what were conservatives? And the easy answer is, they weren't conservatives. They were reactionaries. They wanted to counter progress. That's the again part of the red hat. And now that Roe v. Wade is repealed, progressives are now reactionaries because they want that to go back. And conservatives are now traditionalists. They want things to go even further back. You can be any or all of these positions at any one time. I am a progressive socialist. I want to make changes to current laws to make a more socialist system. But once I achieve the system I want, I will become a conservative socialist. Because conservatism and progressivism, and by extension reactionarism and traditionalism, aren't ideologies. They are policy directions. Very simply, they are, in order, to stay, to go forward, to counter, or to go backwards. If you look at modern politics, progressivism and conservatism isn't what the left-right spectrum is representing. The spectrum is actually showing diversity. This is what the modern left-right spectrum actually scales to. The diversity scale is about how many people you think should be allowed to participate in your system. If you think everyone in the world should have representation in your political system, you're a globalist, the current left. If you think just one person should make the rules, you're an isolationist, the current right. If you line up popular modern political ideologies on this scale to what they are commonly labeled as on the left-right spectrum, you will see that they fit. This is different from the scale of representation. Whereas representation is how equal power is distributed within a system, diversity is about how many people can use the system. Now you might think that allowing everyone in your country to vote would make you the most left, the most diverse, but that is a misconception. Allowing everyone in your country, your political system, to vote makes you center. To move further right, you'll need to remove the votes from being in your system. Denying prisoners the rights to vote or not allowing immigrants to vote all moves you closer to the right. Meanwhile, expanding your system to include people outside of it, like immigrants, moves you to the left, such as being part of a large regional trading bloc. Do you think you're part of the world or not? More importantly, do you think your actions and choices impacts others, and what type of responsibility do you want to take for it? Does your great power also come with great responsibility? That's right, Spider-Man is a lefty. But all of these scales are just preamble, the methods in which we place the keys to power needed to enact the policies of the final scale, equality. Now that you have all these roads to power, time to govern. You have resources. How do you distribute them? Do you find a way to give everyone an equal cut, or do some people get bigger cuts than others? And while I talk about distribution of resources, that also includes the secondary scale of collection. But how we collect the resources isn't as important as how we get to the end point, the equality part. For example, you can have lower tax rate and higher distribution rate if you distribute heavily to those with less resources. We're not looking at the process, we're looking at the end result. What do you want your system to accomplish? And with these 5 scales, representation, institution, direction, diversity, and equality, we can now properly classify our political positions. Let's use myself as an example. In terms of representation, I prefer a high degree of it. Everybody in a community should have an equal amount of sway in the political process. Even if you're an idiot, I think your vote should matter as much as mine. Even if you're a Nazi, your vote should matter the same, right before I punch you in the face for being a Nazi. This gives me a label of democratic. In terms of institution, I prefer a middle ground. I do not want the government to be involved in all aspects of life, such as speech and media, but I do want them involved in the necessities of life, such as healthcare and education. This alone doesn't give me another label yet. In terms of direction, I am currently in a conservative country with a large portion of rules I do not agree with, and I want them to change to something new. This makes me a progressive. This progressiveness can change if laws are passed according to my ideology. In terms of diversity, I believe everyone within the system should have a voice. I also believe that our actions affects the world at large, and we are also affected in terms. In that way, other people should also be allowed to participate in our discussion. There shouldn't be a great firewall to prevent dissent. And finally, equality. I think resources should be taken largely from the rich and redistributed to the masses. However, I do not think we should be completely equal. It should heavily favor the poor while still leaving room for economical growth, which lands me between a centrist position and a full communal ideology. This, along with my stance on diversity and institution, makes me a socialist. There is a 6 scale for how an individual makes decision, but that doesn't affect your ideology. That's just like your personal opinion. If you're curious, I am a moralist in that regards. The Frenchy kind, one of the few good things that came out of the French. And a lot of people in my country are the evangelical religious kind. But all these traits on the scale is what makes me a progressive, democratic socialist. That puts me in line with people like Bernie Sanders. And you might be thinking, fat man, aren't you forgetting about the other famous socialist? To which I have to say, he's not actually a socialist. You know that, right? But fine, we'll run through the political ideology of the face of the Nazi party. I'm talking about the other one. No, the OG. Let's talk about Hitler. I would probably be afraid I'd get demonetized for this segment, but since I'm not monetized anyway, screw it. Piece of shit Hitler. Hitler basically have the representation scale of negligible. He only allowed Germans to participate. Hell, not even Germans, but Aryans. Heck, not even Aryans, but the Aryan race, the pseudo-scientific classification of Aryans. If you think the Aryan race is real, I can't help you, you're just stupid. And a Nazi. Institution. How big does he want it? Big. Very big. All the way big. He wanted to take over the world. He wanted to commit genocide. He committed genocide. That's as big as it gets. When you kill on the scale of nations, you're controlling not just people's healthcare, but their race. You have to control their race, an uncontrollable trait people are born with. This, plus his skill on representation, makes him a fascist. I want to talk a little more about the scales. It's not so much a fixed point, but a spectrum. You see that yellow box there? As long as you fall into that box somewhere, you qualify to be a fascist. You can be an autocrat, an oligarch, and you will still qualify to be fascist. The same goes for that box of representation. What we're looking at is an isolationist, but not all isolationists are fascists. Your isolationism needs to be a nationalist type of isolationism, which is why this scale is descriptive, not comprehensive. And even on the subject of nationalism, there are nuances. You've probably heard of the term ultra-nationalism used to describe fascists before, but you don't have to be an ultra-nationalist to be a fascist. We'll talk more about this later. But so long as you are closer to the scale of an ultra-nationalist, you can be considered an ultra-nationalist. You can be just a nationalist or just a patriot, but as long as your scale is closer to that of an ultra-nationalist than of another option, you may not believe in the creed, but still, you are a fascist. That is the simple definition of fascism. In terms of direction, Hitler was a reactionary. He wasn't happy with Germany's outcome in the First World War, so he was looking to counter that. In terms of diversity, he only wanted people within his border to have a vote. Less than his borders, actually, just his inner circle, actually just himself if he could get away with, which he did. That's a dictatorship. And finally, his equality scale was that the strong, the Aryans should get more, get stronger, and everyone else can suck it. He was a social Darwinist, a pseudo-scientific theory with links to capitalism and eugenics. But unlike myself, whose label is a jumble of these different terms, fascism, with reactionary politics, run by a dictator with social Darwinist policies, can be combined into a single political ideology. We call it Nazism. So let's get down to brass tacks. Are you evil? The world we live in, sadly, overwhelmingly uses the first past the post system of voting. This means that whoever gets more than 50% of the vote wins. This may seem intuitive, but there's a lot of problems with this system. One of it being that we end up with two-party systems. Basically, two political parties usually end up with majority control of a government. Watch CGP Gray's series on the subject to understand why. So when you vote, if you want to actually have a voice, you don't get to choose the party that aligns with your views. Instead, you have to choose the party that is closest to your views. If you live in a country with a capitalist and a centrist party, for example, and you're a socialist, you don't get a socialist party. You have to choose the one that's closest to you. Do that weighing of the scale again, but this time for all the other scales, total up the different closeness, and your political party will be whichever you're nearest to. This is why there are socialists who will vote for the capitalist and libertarians who wants the dictator. The minutiae of their policies might not align, but everything else does. When you have a system like first past the post voting, you will eventually end up with a two-party system. That means that your policies aren't based on what you believe, but what your party believes. That's why we have terms like lifelong Republicans, lifelong Democrats, or in the case of Singapore, things like forever oppositions or forever ruling party. Because even though the policies of these parties will and can change over the decades, you as a voter may not have a closer choice on the scale. Some people might not even think about all of the scale. They might just look at something like representation and ignore everything else and vote for a party that will be detrimental to their very existence. This also means that if a party falls into extremism, it brings almost their entire voter base along with them. Having a voting system that distributes power more evenly, however, makes this more difficult to achieve. Because if you have even just one party in the middle of an extremist and normal party, you don't cut the power of the extremist party by half. You cut it by 3/4. You reduce the dangers of having a fully extremist party in a position to have a plurality of power by a massive amount. So, if you support a person who has the political ideology of Nazism, does that make you a Nazi? Yes, because despite Nazism being a collection of ideologies from these scales, the Nazi Party is a collection of people. They don't have to agree with it, they just have to prefer it to the other option. And halfway between pure evil and not pure evil is still evil. We even have phrases for this position, the banality of evil, of being an Eichmann in Jerusalem. Jon Stewart on The Daily Show recently did a segment on how we shouldn't overblow the attempted acts of the orange fascists, and that we should instead focus on the actual actions that have an effect. He then said this.
Birthright citizenship was very specifically tailored to send a message to people that America was a place. An idea. It wasn't for one race. It wasn't for one gender. Citizenship in America was based on where you were, not who you were. And to just stroke of a pen, finally I agree. That is authoritarian.
We do begin tonight with the federal judge blocking President Trump's executive order that would end birthright citizenship.
And we're back. See how easy that was? It was a dictatorship, and then the judge went, Look, we are facing a deluge of these executive actions, and certainly we must be prepared for those most vulnerable to the consequences of these actions. But this is all fascist argument has become almost a reflex for the left. I would say it's not fascism. Do I not understand what fascism is?
I do not want to do this to John because I do genuinely like him, but yes, John, you do not understand what fascism is. I would even argue that most people don't. You do not need a system of fascism to be a fascist. Your government can have a different scale of politics. It can even be fully democratic. But if your leaders find themselves closer to the scale of fascism to the point that they can do fascist acts, regardless of whether or not those acts succeeds through the system, they are fascists. And the system allows for fascism, and you have to call them as such. You have to be able to point out that this is fascism. To fight evil ideologies, you must not just be able to identify evil ideologies, but call it. I do not call people Nazis because I disagree with them. I disagree with them because they are Nazis. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Special thanks to all my Patreons, and special shout out to my handsome, beautiful and smart Patreon, Oriole, who is a VIP. Thank you very much. Words. They get to watch this video a week earlier, so if you join them, that's what you'll get, early access. If all of you are wondering how I know so much about this topic, it's because for the past few years, I've been on and off designing a game. It's an educational board game meant to teach people about politics. And making the game required me to turn the complicated axis of politics and ideologies. Making a game required me to turn the complicated axis of politics and ideologies into something that can be visually comprehended, like you can see it on on a board. UI for political ideologies, basically. The skills that I've introduced to you here will actually be used in the game. If I ever successfully turn the game around and get it made, you guys will definitely 100% hear about it. You will never stop hearing about it. It will be like, get by my game, yo, whoa. Aside from that, while this video is not monetized, I do hope to get this channel monetized within the year. So if you like any of my videos, please consider sharing them. That really, really helps. Commenting and liking also really helps. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.